very exciting, I think, because Lara and I will be talking about very similar issues, but kind of building onto each other's approaches. So I hope it will be interesting for you. Just to give you a bit of context to my talk, this was originally scheduled for Academic Book Week in mid-November, had to be cancelled due to illness. So I've abridged it ever so slightly to fit this format. It's quite introductory, so some of the issues I'm going to discuss may be familiar to some of you already, but some of them may be new or sort of broadening your horizons. So I hope there will be something in it for everyone. So as some of you may know, my research, or part of my research, looks at experimental digital-born literary fictions rather than academic books. And these types of fiction have been proliferating in the past decade or so. And what's interesting is that increasingly we see these texts moving from what used to be mostly sort of individual-based reading or interacting, increasingly into museum and exhibition spaces, so that they gain more of a public face for people to go into a public space and interact with them, but also watch other people interacting with them, and that obviously adds a whole new component to perceiving, to interacting with them. So so today I'm going to look at various ways in which creativity has been applied to the idea of the book in the broadest sense, as an object of literary interaction and communication, not on paper but on digital interfaces. So what am I actually talking about here? Digital fiction, as defined by the Lieberhorn International Digital Fiction Network, is fiction written for and read on a computer screen in the broadest sense, that pursues its verbal, discursive and/or conceptual complexity through the digital medium and would lose something of its aesthetic and semiotic function if it were removed from that medium. This means digital fiction is born digital, it's made for computer-based interaction, and the work doesn't really emerge as a semiotic or material phenomenon until someone interacts with it and makes it appear, so to speak, in front of them, using keyboard, mouse, touchpad, whatever, hardware and software. And every reading experience tends to be different, sometimes radically so. Think about hypertext fiction, for instance, where everyone reads different lexias or chunks, windows in a different order. Sometimes even yourself, when you revisit a hypertext, can be a completely different image or understanding of the text emerging from that. So that means a digital fiction can't be printed, because this would limit its textuality to one particular manifestation, and the interaction with the print text is, as we know, very different and far more pre-structured, if you will, than interaction with digital-born work. So I've mentioned hypertext fiction, there's also interactive fiction, there's sort of more hypermedia, more multimodal ways of displaying or making digital fiction. Think of Flash or QuickTime, Java-based works. Also literary games, think about those. App fictions, immersive fictions, there's more and more and more. In the longer version of my talk, I go into some more detail about what predated digital fictions, because the idea of non-linear or multilinear reading, of breaking up the page, of making the book, turning it into more of an interactive tool that you turn around and even here to cut individual lines, as in Ulipian poetry, to recombine, so the reader can actually make his or her own work and reread it several times, and basically be a very active component of the authoring process. This is not new, and also the antilinearity of reading you have in glosses and medieval glosses already. This was, of course, artistically expressed quite strongly in footnote fiction. Lila's going to talk more about the footnote later, so I won't give away too much. Postmodernist writing more generally, where the footnote becomes almost the core text, or it does actually in Pale Fire, for instance. But think of more sort of youth-oriented or popular media, like Choose Your Own Adventure novels, where you choose different pathways, almost like a game. So there's lots of cognates in print culture. So on this slide, I've put together a tentative timeline for digital fiction developments, because new works have proliferated with the emergence of new technologies, And there's been a somewhat exponential growth in the number of works, but also the range of technologies available, which have shaped aesthetic schools or movements, for lack of a better word, and technological genres. So one early form of digital fiction was interactive fiction. I put Pong here, not because it's a digital fiction, but more so you can see historically where this all emerged. So Pong is one of the very first computer games, or commercially traded computer games. So here, interactive fiction started out mostly as a commercial phenomenon in the game sector, think of Infocom, but has more recently inhabited a very active indie niche of aficionados making interactive fictions using Inform 7 and other types of user-friendly applications. So don't see these as sort of discontinuing. It's something that happens at the same time, just starts, like much like a tree that grows and continues to grow in different sections. So the late 80s and 90s, early 90s then saw the growth of serious hypertext, very text-based, very text-heavy. Hypertext fiction and poetry made in dedicated or not so dedicated software packages like HyperCard and StorySpace. And these texts have since been traded and read from data carriers like floppies and CD-ROMs. And this is this goes against the grain of the avant-garde trajectory of digital fiction. It doesn't want to be commercial, it doesn't really want to be sold. And so that's probably one of the reasons why Eastgate and StorySpace hypertext fiction never really became very popular, because A, it's hard to read, and B, it doesn't seem to match the avant-garde agenda that's behind digital fiction. The emergence of the web with graphic browsers and a growing range of audiovisual design software then afforded the growth of web-based hyperfiction using Flash, Java and so on. So hypertext became increasingly hypermedia and multimodal, as well as playful and game-like. So one general trend we can see is the blending and hybridization of formerly separate art forms, literature, fine art, music, games, and so on, cinema. And this is particularly salient in the literary games we've seen emerging in the past decade or so. So I've written a whole book about this if you want to read more about them. Different types of games, but yeah, it's a growing sector. There have also been attempts to create physical and or virtual 3D experiences. By that I mean they can either be very much consumed like a game in a virtual 3D world, or as a walk-in space like a cave or a white box, or some physical box where you can walk in and then you are, I don't know, bombarded with words. For instance, you can walk through language, you can push language away, and it becomes very much of a physical, embodied experience. And then, of course, the advent and boom of tablets and other portable devices has given rise to new forms of multi-touch. App fiction, here, which we read using our fingers, tapping, sliding, pinching, all the different types of finger interaction or hand interaction. So you can imagine this timeline very much as a mushrooming tree, a rhizomatic genealogical network, where the individual nodes and branches are technologically and aesthetically interrelated, but form their very own characteristics. So what do I mean by that? Every work of digital fiction almost, has to be learned from scratch. So it's not like a book which you approach knowing pretty much what you're doing. You just read a book, you've learned how to read. But reading is only one part, important part, mind you, of reading, of digital fiction literacy, because you have to know how to use the software, this specific software and hardware arrangement. And it's almost like a scaffolding process where you use your other types of media literacy and experiences that you've gained over time, and you recombine them into a new literacy or skill set to read this particular work. But it's can be a bit of a challenge, but if you embrace it, it can be very rewarding. So in the remainder of this talk, I'm going to focus on the role of the reader and their techniques of reading specific types of digital fiction. And I'll use quite a lot of examples so you can see what I'm talking about. So 3 types: the reader, the player, and the metaleptic projection. In the early days of hypertext fiction, George Landau proposed the concept of the reader, the W, of virtual co-authorship between reader and writer, which was inspired by the Barthesian idea of the writerly text. And it suggests that hypertext readers are empowered by the ability to put together their own reading paths and create their own narratives in this way. And in many ways, the idea was found to be flawed, because what happens when you read a digital hypertext fiction is that you get very much disoriented. You're not given the full image of the different lexias you have to read, or even a sense of an ending, a sense of closure. You're very much lost in hyperspace, and that is actually intentional. It's part of the author's intent, but the effect this has on the reader can be quite discouraging and frustrating, and definitely not empowering. So it's actually quite the opposite. Having said that, more recently with social media fiction and people interacting and co-writing stories using various types of social media, I think this concept has come more into its own without anyone actually explicating it like that. But there are different degrees of W-ness, if you will, readerliness again. Second, the reader can also be seen as the player of digital fiction, and here we have to distinguish between different nuances in meaning of the word play. We can play with an object, much like a child plays with a toy. So this is unstructured play, it's not rule-based, it's just random. So we play with language, we play with all sorts of things. But there's also play in a transitive sense, where we play a game, a rule-based object with winning and termination conditions, with challenges and reward mechanisms. So fairly heavily regulated. And this is the second type. But there's also a type of play with those rules, okay, with almost in a reflexive way, where we are made to think about how the game has been made, what kind of philosophy is behind it, what kind of critique can be added to the whole process, and of course, how we as players or readers are part of maybe some kind of complicit arrangement. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. And then finally, there's the idea of the reader becoming part of the text world, or being made to feel, at least, like they are, through various different semiotic and ludic means. And that's the idea of metalepsis, a narratological term meaning transcending ontological boundaries, logically incompatible worlds or spheres like the fictional world and the actual world, which can't really merge logically. But metalepsis describes processes of deluding readers into the merging idea. You know, we feel like we are drawn in or immersed. So let's look at the reader with a W first. On this slide you can see a typical story space hypertext interface, or rather two main canonical hypertext fictions. Afternoon, a story by Michael Joyce here. This text is read in chunks or lexias, very much language-based, hardly any visuals, hardly any images. And we click on individual words or buttons here in the interface, and you can see how strongly affiliated this is to print culture. When you look at the buttons, we can go back, given a book, which kind of means it brings up all the different links you can follow on this particular lexia. You can answer questions posed by the narrative, if you don't want to hear about it. You can print this page if you want, and you can add notes. Mind you, this is the type of co-authorship that very much influenced Landau when he said, you know, this is readerly, but it doesn't have this effect really. Patchwork Girl has got a more reader-friendly approach in that it gives you more map views, more comprehensive views of what the narrative is in terms of scope. Also, like a phrenology here, it's a pseudoscientific map of a human skull or brain, which at least you know what's there, right? At least you know what links are there in one big view, and yeah, you can see roughly what else you still need to read or could be reading. So I mean, not just because of that, but also because the writing is a lot more intuitive, a lot more, it inspires more reflections and associations. It's an adaptation of Frankenstein, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, from a feminist point of view. So if you had a choice between those two, I would probably go for Patchwork Girl. Having said all that, Landau was quite clearly applying the reader concept to hypertext fiction, but I think a far more convincing application of it is the reader of interactive fiction. I've mentioned Infocom before, and here the overlap between literary reading and gameplay is one of the strongest in this field, I would argue. As you can see in this example, Galatea by Emily Short, we're given chunks of text, but they're all in one window, so it scrolls. You can always go back to what you've read before. And importantly, you don't just read, but you write into the text. So you enter commands into the prompt line, and depending on what you enter, you get further additional narrative information. So you have to be quite creative in what you come up with. And there are some standard default commands and abbreviations, X that stands for examine, for instance. But especially in the more artsy and more independent, more forward-thinking interactive fictions, you have to come up with very creative ways of interacting with the text and using language so as to get the maximum amount of information. And this is important when an interactive fiction is more like gameplay, where you have to solve riddles and really achieve the kind of credits, sometimes even the points, to get you up to the next level of the narrative. Okay. Yes, and then there's the idea of social media fiction. And I said earlier that the reader with a W has far more come into his own in recent years with social media, giving readers almost the same rights as writers and kind of bring them both onto an even keel. But there are big discrepancies again. Think of Jennifer Egan's Black Box, for instance, which is a Twitter fiction, which was posted in hourly installations, hourly posts in May 2012. It's brilliant text, it's really captivating. It's written in the second person, so it's a great read, but it's not a great piece of twiterature because it doesn't allow reader interaction. It does allow it in the sense that you, of course, every post you can favorite or you can repost and all sorts of things, but that's not the idea. The idea is that everyone reads what Jennifer Egan has written, and in fact, it's actually been republished as a whole later on in the Washington Post. I think it's now available for free. So this is an example of social media fiction where the W is actually quite small. A more intriguing concept, I think, is NetProf, which you have in an example in the middle here. NetProf means networked improvised narrative, and its underlying idea is crowdsourcing networked stories in highly original improvised ways from the web, from social media, but also from physically present participants like a theatre audience or people visiting an installation. American writer Rob Whittick is a pioneer in this area, and his work Grace, Wit and Charm was live streamed over the web while being performed in May 2011 by a professional theatre company, and the audience, both online and offline, could contribute and shape the narrative in this way, and their contributions were directly embedded in the development. So it's very much site-specific, it's very much live and in the here and now, but an intriguing idea when it comes to the idea of the reader, of co-authorship. And then there are dedicated co-writing platforms like Figly here, where someone starts a fiction and has a word cap, say, I don't know, 50 words or something, and then someone else continues from it, and that's the whole idea that you just continue from someone else's story. This particular one is no longer active, but this is probably where the balance is the most equal, perhaps in all the different approaches to social media fiction. There's lots more out there, and especially experts in fan fiction will be able to add to this tremendously, I'm sure. So moving on to the reader as a player. And this is not a new idea at all. The play with literary material, with words or with literary structures, indeed the play with the reader, can be seen as early as Baroque, labyrinth, or visual poetry, concrete and Oulipian poetry in the 20th century, and then of course in experimental fiction more generally, think of Tristram Shandy, think of Danielewski, B.S. Johnson, and so on. So the concept is innate to literary creativity and innovation, And since much digital fiction situates itself in this avant-garde tradition, we find a lot of interesting medium-specific texts that play with the uniqueness of the medium and implications for consumption and interaction. So intermediality, for example, is featured in The Princess Murderer, which is a hint at the kind of mindless killing and misogyny that you get in mainstream game culture. So all you can do as a reader is click on buttons, and every click triggers a sigh from a princess. Every click, you can't escape it. And it basically symbolizes your killing or your raping or your breeding of princesses in the castle, and so you're complicit with the Manichaean villain Bluebeard. And you can see how many princesses are in your castle at any given point on the princess census. So it's got very many elements of gameplay, although it's not a game. You can't win this. There's no end to it. In that way, it's quite hypertextual, but yeah, a strong hint, a critical hint at game culture. In the app fiction Pry by Samantha Gorman and Denny Canizaro, the title is suggestive of the way readers are expected to interact with the text, form echoes function, which you get a lot in this idea of readerly gameplay. So here we have a protagonist who's come back from the first Gulf War in the early 90s. He's gradually losing his eyesight, and we as readers quite literally and physically have to pry open his eyes, and to find out more about his past, but also his subconscious. And the way this has been programmed in a very multimedia way, I think, is intriguing. So one of the chapters looks a bit like this, so you can either conflate or expand text, get more and more. This is weird because normally you read from top to bottom, but it actually adds language in the middle. So you kind of read it again from the top because it means something else now. And you get different types of animated or non-animated text or film. So it's intriguing, I love it. If you want, you can play around with it a little bit. So it uses these different types of pinching and stretching and swiping in very creative ways. A second and more narrow meaning of the word play relates to rules, to structured play. In the transitive form of the verb play, we play something, typically a game, and we associate with it certain expectations like challenges, rules, winning, losing, improvement, leveling up, you know it. In this sense, literary games proper are actual games that we play with the ambition to perform in a certain way. And I've got an example here from Gregory Weir's Silent Conversation, which uses existing literary texts but transforms them into a platformer like Super Mario. So you have this cursor and you have to hit as many words in the narrative as you can, but there are enemy words, and if you hit them, it kind of undoes everything you've done so far, so you have to jump on them. But you don't know that at the beginning, so you have to work it out for yourself. And then you get scores here. It actually shows you how well you're doing at any given point, and of course you want an A at the end, don't you? But I think if we read something more figurative into it, we can say it's obviously impossible to fully and comprehensively understand or grasp or capture the meaning of any literary work, and this is kind of orchestrated or staged in this game. So the approximation of meaning and the constant struggle of the reader with the literary text. But then, as readers, we can also play on a meta level, or meta-ludic level, ludic meaning game-like, playful. We can play with or against the rules of a game, which of course evokes the idea of cheating, a very important part of game culture. And one distinctive quality often found in literary games is their affordance for us as players to play with the rules. It's a very important reflexive component. Because we subvert in this way the rigidity of rules and a lot of other things as well. So this idea is firmly built into Tale of Tells's The Path, a remediation of the Little Red Riding Hood myth, where we're given one very simple rule at the beginning. Yes, go to grandmother's house and stay on the path. But if we stay on the path, we fail. the game takes 5 minutes and it's over. So we have to go off the beaten track, and we have to meet the wolf, we have to meet our downfall in very graphic, well, not graphic ways in a visual sense, but mostly imaginary. Because what happens to the little girls that we play is only hinted at by the visual narrative and the different fragments that you get from their traumatic memories. So she can die, she can be raped, she can fall into a river or a lake or something like that. So you can read this in a very philosophical way, a maturing process, the kind of mistakes, the trials and tribulations of young adolescent girls. But yeah, I mean, it's a very dark one as well, a gothic game. It's beautiful though, highly recommended. So finally I'd like to discuss one particular role or technique of reading digital fiction, which relates to the ways in which we are projected into the story world or vice versa. I've mentioned metalepsis before, and digital fiction writers have experimented with this idea extensively and created a range of variations of so-called interactional metalepsis. Alice Bell has recently done quite a lot of work on this. In Tim Guthrie's and Lance Olson's hypermedia fiction 1001, for example, the cursor projects the reader into the story world, or at least some kind of navigational meta level. So we can tap onto people's backs here, like this is a cinema audience. And of course we don't physically tap on their backs. This is prevented by the glass screen that we have in front of us. So this is this kind of meta level. But still, we then get their most intimate thoughts about their own problems, about what's going on screen and so on. So we really feel like we are delving into this fictional world quite physically. And a more outward-looking metaleptic process is triggered by the metaleptic links in the narrative. So the Mall of America is the setting of the fiction, but it actually exists in the real world. It's the Mall of America in Bloomington, Minnesota, and it's actually got a website, right? And when you click on this link, you get to the actual real world website, and this changes all the time. And quite naturally, whatever you get to see at the particular moment of visiting this website will shape your feelings about the narrative and your understanding of it as well. So historically, this is quite an interesting process of commercial history. Okay. Oh yeah. In another fiction called Loss of Grasp, and another hypermedia fiction, you get a metaleptic keyboard and camera. So in Loss of Grasp, the idea is that it's a middle-aged man, the protagonist, first-person narrator, is literally losing grasp of his life. He doesn't know what to do with himself. He's losing, any kind of grip of life and relationship. He can't relate to his wife or his son anymore. And this is projected onto the reader, or vice versa, by the technology. So we get a window, quite simple black text window, into which we can type anything we want, but it'll be automatically transformed to his rather self-pitying lament. I'm doing all I can, but it's not working. So we are turned into the protagonist. And a similar way of doing this is with the metaleptic camera, which projects ourselves, like films ourselves and projects in the fiction. And all we can do with the cursor is blur our image, and this is then accompanied by this, interior monologue. I feel manipulated. I don't know what to do, and I don't have a clear sense of self. Finally, and this is where we're crossing into games territory again, readers can be re-embodied in the story world as first or third-person avatars. First person here, where you don't actually see the character whom you're playing, or third person here. So I've mentioned the path before. This is an image from the path, and this is obviously quite clearly a game. But Nightingale's Playground isn't. It looks like a game, but it's very much a 3D navigational environment which you walk through in order to get more textual information, especially about this mysterious character Alex, this semi-imaginary character who seems to determine very much about the self-understanding, the identity of the first-person narrator, and we kind of delve into it, slip into his skin in order to find out more about this character. yeah, I love this. It's a really well done immersive narrative, digital fiction. An example of how these immersive 3D reading experiences might manifest themselves in the future has just been launched in Sheffield as part of the Opening Up the Book Festival, and it'll come to Pontio in May next year. It's called Wallpaper, and it's a site-specific 3D digital fiction installation, a walk-in space. So imagine it as a box. You walk into a box, and then you get a controller, and you see a massive screen in front of you, and you navigate the game in this way. It's Gothic again. It uses ambient lighting, so while you're walking through the house, the light will, it'll basically dim, and it'll get darker and darker, and this adds to the eerie atmosphere. So I think I mentioned site specificity before. This will become more and more important because compare an 18th century urban art gallery like Bank Street Arts, where Wallpaper is at the moment, with the white box in Pontio, where this will happen in May. I think people will have very different experiences depending on where they're coming from or where the actual installation is situated. So I think this will be an intriguing add-on to the theoretical development of digital fiction. So I hope I've managed to show you how wide and diverse the range of texts, technologies and reading techniques has become in the area of digital fiction. And whilst a lot of these techniques will and probably should remain unique to the works they're made for, some of them may well be adapted to more commercial mainstream publishing. Possibly the 3D approaches to becoming more immersed into a learning world or something, learning environment. Also maybe being able to add more creatively to what you are perceiving. I could well imagine that happening. But don't want to make any predictions. I know it's all connected with a lot of commercial, financial effort. And obviously everything you've seen, all those works are there to be examined as unique artifacts. So they want to be pushing the boundaries. They want to be unique and innovative. So this is a very much of an independent sector. But anyway, we shall see what will happen in the academic book industry in the years to come. Thank you. And I shall now hand over to Lyle.